The way you feel during and after lessons with your teacher impacts your progress more than you think. And this is relevant for both professional and amateur students. Even hobbyist players often feel very intimidated and vulnerable when approaching professional players with a lesson request. And I've heard countless dramatic stories about how teachers sometimes exploit students' insecurity. In this video, I'll give you some tips on how to avoid these painful situations. Pressure can be absolutely essential for bringing out our best, particularly at a younger age when the ability to work hard and maintain concentration for extended periods and defer gratification is not yet disciplined. But I would say that there are different kinds of pressure, both helpful and harmful. For example, I had two very contrasting experiences. An experience of being kind of really scared of one of my teachers. I used to study with Eliso Versaladze for 4 years, and she's a phenomenal player and a very, very strict teacher. So strict that Boris Berezovsky, who is one of her early students, notoriously mentioned in his later interviews that he's still scared of Versaladze. I don't know whether it's true, but that's the legend. And each lesson with her was a major trial, basically, that could end in disaster after the first note and refusal to continue the lesson if you are not well prepared. For example, quite often we would have situations where a student would come to play and they would just play the first note, and then immediately Eliso would say something like, "Oh my God, that's so terrible," and she would jump in and just destroy every note of your performance and practice with you one bar for 1 hour and so on. And yet, studying with her was not only useful, it was truly inspiring. I couldn't wait to get back to the practice room afterwards. And another experience I had was a teacher that was kind enough and polite and never behaving too explosively. And yet, lessons with them were so depressing that after the lessons, I had a habit not to practice anymore that day. And I was in disgust to playing, and what I didn't realize then, and what was even worse, I was in disgust to myself after these lessons. For example, most of the lessons, they would not really teach you much, but this person would just share memories about their past great students. So they would always linger in the past. And once it was even an absurd situation where I came with a Beethoven sonata and I was preparing to a competition, this one. And I played the piece, which I already could play very well because I was 1 month from a Maria Canals competition. And they just said to me, "Oh, Denis, my ex-student," I won't tell names, of course. "My ex-student played it so beautifully. So let's listen to a recording." And he made me to listen to a recording of his ex-student during the lesson. And then when when we listened to a recording, they asked me, "Okay, Dennis, do you understand? This is how you have to play." And that was it. They didn't provide me with any other further instructions. I was just supposed to listen to recording and copy as much as I could. So this is, of course, a kind of humiliating way to teach, I would say, and a very lazy one, at least. So what was the difference? Why, when Versaladze was crying like, "Oh, that's so horrible, no, ужас," and so on, and other strong ways to express critique to a student, why it wasn't really harmful? Why everyone was so afraid of her, but nobody really was traumatized, at least in my circle? And why it was less harmful than a more polite way of teaching? It took me actually a few years to figure that out. The key difference, in my opinion, is in the teacher's belief in a student and whether a teacher respects a student. So if a teacher believes that a student has potential to unlock and sincerely wants to help them reach their goals, they can be very tough and very demanding, but a student feels intuitively that it's solely because the stakes are so high and they must give the very best effort they can get to get what they deserve. But if a teacher doesn't believe in a student, if they are like, Faramir's father from Lord of the Rings, who simply doesn't believe in their son or in their student, unconditionally, preferring the other students all the time, or if they have some issues and humiliate the dignity of his student in any way, even if in a very subtle way. If they don't believe that you deserve success in any form, they may be even very polite and teach you properly from the formal studying perspective, but on the non-verbal level, you might consciously or non-consciously read the message. Anyway, whatever you do sucks because you suck. And this is a major problem for a student, which has to be addressed because this kind of situation can undermine your self-confidence and courage to project your voice in art. And those qualities are often more important than the skill level itself. And I've seen so many brilliantly taught students who would go to a stage on a competition, for example, and they would deliver a skillful performance, but psychologically they are so unsure about themselves that it just doesn't work. It doesn't convince, it doesn't inspire. And then no matter how they practice, they just hit a wall and they can't really get success they want. So what should you do if you have a teacher that you can't or don't want to change, but you feel depressed, for example, and unworthy after their lessons? There's, of course, no one simple answer, but one option available is to stand your ground despite someone's disbelief or humiliation. But this requires a very important shift in your attitude, in your headspace. You have to understand that a teacher is not a god to worship or to be afraid of, no matter how reputable they are. Basically, and I say it as a teacher is basically staff who is paid directly by you or the institution who is covering your scholarship, for example, to do their job properly. And my friend, for example, a very good pianist, had once a lesson with a teacher who was famous for being insulting at times. And a teacher told to my friend once after they played with disgust. And this teacher was French, so you can imagine this kind of face. And they said, like, you play like shit. And most people, of course, most students, hearing something like that from their influential teacher would feel shamed, unworthy, anxious, cancelled, and most likely it will have long-term implications on their confidence level and psychological health even. But my friend, actually, was a hard worker and very, very diligent student and a very mature individual. They made a choice to defend his dignity. So he said, well, maybe it's because you're a shit teacher. And after the initial shock on the face of his teacher, he saw a glimpse of respect and admiration on the face of a person who was full of disgust and boredom just a second ago. And after that, their relations were much better because a teacher understood that a student actually has guts. So I do not want to fall into victim blaming, of course, but I consistently observe that different students can have radically different experiences with the same teacher. In other words, teachers react to student behavior far more than we like to admit. And I notice this clearly in my own teaching. For example, without consciously deciding to do so, I adapt my teaching style depending on a student. With some student, I stay very grounded. Technical efficiency, stylistic precision, fingering, constructive and pragmatic work. And with other students, I suddenly become much more imaginative, and musical metaphors suddenly appear, and associations multiply, and my language becomes more poetic. And I effectively function as a mirror reflecting back a version of what the student brings into the lesson. Not intentionally, but absolutely inevitably. The same dynamic applies to cases of trauma and harassment. I've seen situations where a student approached a teacher with a clear, pragmatic attitude. I pay for education, do your job, teach me. And the result was a professional, respectful working environment where the student received valuable information, boundaries were clear, and even a famous guru-like teacher adjusted their behavior to the point of saying, well, this is my suggestion, you can play it this way, but only if you like. And in contrast, another student approached the same teacher with an unconscious expectation of emotional support and combined with deep insecurity. And the combination of a student's emotional vulnerability and this teacher's lack of emotional intelligence led to a catastrophe because the teacher sensed this weakness and began behaving in an increasingly imperative and domineering way. And the student, who initially sought support instead of challenge, they became even more defensive and more hurt. So eventually they parted ways. The teacher was convinced that the student was too difficult, and the student left deeply insulted and genuinely traumatized. So two different students, same teacher, two absolutely different outcomes. That said, of course, I'm not excusing toxic personalities, and there is serious work to be done in the field of professional ethics, of course, and especially in highly competitive environments. Sometimes it's just a disaster. But you cannot fix every arrogant teacher out there. What you can do is educate yourself. So work through your own insecurities and unresolved trauma. Understand one simple fact. A teacher is a hired professional whose job is to share knowledge with you at an agreed hourly rate. Nothing more. Payment and service. Pragmatic, real, and safe. So you don't need guru mythology around your teachers. You don't need to seek external validations. You don't have to worry about what if they don't like how I play. It truly does not matter what a teacher thinks about your playing. The irony of this field is that in the vast majority of cases, your teacher will have little to no impact on your career. They are not your agent. And if you study with a concert pianist, by teaching you, they basically raise a competitor. So there is absolutely no chance they will introduce you to their agent. Of course, there are some very rare exceptions, but generally, you can't really expect that your teacher will influence your career in a really meaningful way. So even if your teacher thinks that you play terribly, it usually has no real influence on your professional future. Like, for example, in my case, when I studied with this teacher who made me feel depressive, just after 1 month of that, listening to a recording episode where they made me to listen to recording instead of actually teaching me, just 1 month after I won that competition with the same sonata. And when I came back, I could see their amazement on the face, and they were like, oh my God, you won this competition? They couldn't believe I was worthy of this. They couldn't believe that I deserved this. And nevertheless, I did it. So I was like, go to hell. And of course, I switched a teacher very soon afterwards. I often receive messages from students that start their messages with something like, Denis, I would like to have a lesson with you, but you will probably be bored with me. I'm such an intermediate player, and so on. So please do not do this when you approach anyone. First, do not make assumptions about other people and how they will feel about you, because you never know. And assumptions automatically put you in a very awkward position if you don't guess correctly. And it's very similar to situations where people, instead of asking me, Denis, where are you from? They just jump into assumptions and they ask me, are you Russian? And I'm like, so this is simply rude. You don't really do this. So you never do assumptions, whether somebody will be bored with you or you will become best friends. You don't know that. And second, do not feel apologetic for who you are, because you're making your journey and somebody can be infinitely ahead of you, but it doesn't mean that your journey has no value. So even if, hypothetically, I were to think something arrogant like, oh, who do they think they are? I'm such a great teacher. Why would I waste my time on someone who is not a genius? This wouldn't be about you. That would be about me being a jerk. That's it. And that's never a student's responsibility. So you have absolutely no reason to worry about any of this. That perspective alone can already remove a dangerous amount of pressure from you. I hope that this perspective helps some of you overcome difficulties in relationships with teachers, or at least prepares you better for similar situations you may encounter later in life. So I'm eager to hear about your experiences and whether you agree with me or not. And if you want to study with me, you can check out my courses on piano playing by following the link in the description. Thank you for watching this and see you next time.